In this video we will explore Japan during the Second World War. We will follow Japan from the beginning of the war and follow through to the end. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and/or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. There is a country made of islands. 4 great ones, and thousands of smaller ones scattered across the western Pacific like stones dropped by a careless hand, each one green and mountainous, ringed by sea. Japan. The Japanese call it Nihon, which means, roughly, the place where the sun originates. The source of light. For centuries, it kept to itself. A civilization entire unto itself, refined and ancient, with its own art and poetry and warfare, its own gods, its own silences. Mountains ran down the spine of the islands like vertebrae. Cherry blossoms fell every spring, brief and perfect, and the falling of them was considered beautiful precisely because it was brief. Nothing lasts. Everything passes. There was, in the culture, a deep understanding of impermanence. But by the early 20th century, the world had grown too small for isolation. Japan had watched as the great European empires Britain, France, the Netherlands reached their arms across Asia, claiming coastlines, ports, whole nations. It had watched as its neighbor China, vast and ancient, was carved apart by foreign powers. And Japan had decided, it would not be carved. It would not be a subject nation. It would be an empire of its own. By the 1930s, Japan had already been at war for years before the world called it a world war. In 1931, Japanese forces moved into Manchuria, the northeastern region of China. In 1937, they pushed deeper into Beijing, into Shanghai, into the city of Nanjing. The war in China was brutal, as wars are, but it was more than brutal. It was something that would haunt Japan's conscience for generations. Atrocities in Nanjing, the killing of civilians, of prisoners, the kind of violence that human beings are capable of when command dissolves into chaos and cruelty, when men far from home are given too much power over those with none. The Japanese military in those years was not a monolith. It was composed of men, young men, many of them farmers' sons from quiet provinces, who had been shaped by years of discipline and indoctrination, who believed in the divinity of the emperor, who believed in sacrifice and honor, who were also afraid and far from home and sometimes capable of terrible things. Wars are made of institutions, but they are also made of people. It is possible to hold both truths. By 1941, Japan's attention had turned south and east. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia. The rubber and tin of Malaya. The rice of Burma and Indochina. Japan was a nation with a large military and very few natural resources of its own, and it needed fuel. It needed steel. It needed the materials of empire. The United States, alarmed by Japan's expansion and the deepening alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, the Axis Pact signed in 1940, had begun cutting off trade. An embargo on oil. A freezing of assets. A slowly tightening pressure. The Japanese High Command saw a narrowing window. They could pull back from China unthinkable after so much sacrifice. They could submit to American demands intolerable, they believed, to national pride and strategic survival. Or they could strike first, fast, and decisively, and seize what they needed before the Americans could respond. It was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was, in many ways, a man of contradictions. He had studied at Harvard. He had lived in the United States. He liked poker. He understood Americans in ways that many of his colleagues did not, and that understanding made him cautious about the war they were planning. He had told his government, privately, that he could promise 6 months of victories, perhaps a year, but that he could not promise what came after. He was right. But no one listened to that part. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft rose from the decks of 6 aircraft carriers north of Hawaii and flew south through the pale early light. It was a Sunday. The American sailors at Pearl Harbor were sleeping, or eating breakfast, or writing letters home. The Hawaiian morning was warm and soft, the kind of morning that makes people feel, briefly, that the world is generous. The first wave arrived at 7:48 in the morning. The bombs fell into the harbor. Ships that had been resting at anchor, enormous things, gray, and still began to burn. The Arizona took a direct hit to her forward magazine, the chamber where the gunpowder was stored, and the explosion that followed was so massive that the ship sank in 9 minutes. 1,177 men went down with her. Most of them are still there, sealed in the hull beneath the harbor water, designated a war grave, a place of permanent rest. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When it was over, 2,403 Americans were dead. 18 ships were sunk or damaged. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Japan had achieved, tactically, nearly everything it had planned. The American fleet had been crippled. But the aircraft carriers had not been in port that day. They were at sea. Yamamoto knew this. And he knew what it meant. Rest, now, for a moment. Let that morning settle. The world changed in those 2 hours. The United States, which had been hovering at the edge of the war supplying Britain, watching Europe burn, arguing at home about whether it was their fight, was suddenly, irrevocably in. The next day, President Roosevelt stood before Congress and called December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and Congress voted to declare war on Japan with only a single dissenting vote. Germany and Italy, honoring the Axis Pact, declared war on the United States days later. The war that had been smoldering across Europe and Asia for years had, at last, become one fire. In Tokyo, there was celebration in the streets. The news of Pearl Harbor had been announced on the radio, and people poured out of their homes into the cold December air, waving flags, weeping with pride. The Emperor Hirohito, a quiet, bookish man more interested in marine biology than in warfare, had given his formal sanction to the attack. He was considered divine, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, at least in the official theology of the state. Ordinary Japanese people did not think of him as a man in the way they thought of other men. He existed in a different register, remote and sacred. But he was a man. And the country he presided over was about to enter years of suffering that most of those celebrating citizens could not yet imagine. In the first months, the victories came quickly. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress at the southern tip of Asia, surrendered in February 1942, 80,000 Allied soldiers laying down their arms. It was one of the greatest military defeats in British history. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Japan had, in a matter of months, assembled the largest empire in Asia since the Mongols. It called this empire the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The name was a kind of propaganda, a suggestion that Asian peoples were being liberated from Western colonialism and united under Japanese leadership. And in some places, briefly, some people believed it. The Japanese had, in fact, driven out the British and the Dutch and the Americans. There were Asian leaders who saw in Japan's victories at least the possibility of a different future. But the co-prosperity sphere was, in practice, its own form of empire, often brutal forced labor, looted resources, violence against civilians who resisted. Liberation was not the word that most people under Japanese occupation would have chosen. And so the year 1942 opened with Japan at the height of its power. The empire stretched from the cold waters north of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, down through the Central Pacific, through Southeast Asia, and west toward the borders of India. It was vast. It was, for a moment, almost exactly what the architects of Japan's expansion had dreamed of. But Yamamoto had been right about the window. 6 months. Perhaps a year. In June of 1942, at a place in the Central Pacific called Midway, the American carriers that had not been in Pearl Harbor met the Japanese fleet. The battle lasted 4 days. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese communications. The Americans knew where the Japanese fleet would be. In the course of those 4 days, Japan lost 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, along with their experienced pilots and aircrew men who had taken years to train and who could not easily be replaced. The tide of the Pacific War turned at Midway, though it would take 3 more years for the tide to finish coming in. There is a particular quality of darkness in a tropical jungle at night. It is not the clean darkness of an open field, where your eyes adjust and the stars eventually give you something to see by. It is a layered darkness, leaf over leaf over leaf, the canopy so thick that even moonlight cannot find the forest floor. The sounds are constant and alive, insects in their millions, the drip of moisture from fronds, the occasional distant crash of something large moving through the undergrowth. The heat does not lift when the sun goes down. It simply changes texture. Wet heat, close and breathing, like being inside something alive. This is the darkness in which the Pacific War was mostly fought. Not in the clean tactical movements of maps and arrows. In mud. In heat. In the particular misery of men far from home, eating badly, sleeping poorly, sick with diseases that had no regard for which side you were on. Guadalcanal. The name is Melanesian, belonging to an island in the Solomon Chain, northeast of Australia, about 2,200 miles from Tokyo and roughly the same from Pearl Harbor. Before the war, it was almost unknown outside the region, a mountainous, jungle-covered island, malarial, with a small coconut plantation and not much else. A place no one had thought to want. And then, in the summer of 1942, Japan began building an airstrip there. An airstrip on Guadalcanal would put Japanese aircraft within reach of the supply lines between the United States and Australia. It was a strategic move, and the Americans understood it immediately. In August 1942, less than 2 months after Midway, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal and seized the unfinished airstrip. They named it Henderson Field, after a Marine aviator killed at Midway. What followed was 6 months of some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. Japan sent troops by night, down a chain of islands the Americans called the Slot, in fast destroyer runs that sailors on both sides nicknamed the Tokyo Express. They came in darkness, unloaded men and supplies, and were gone before dawn. The Americans could not easily stop them. And so the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were reinforced again and again, while simultaneously the Americans were reinforcing their own position. The island became a trap that both sides kept feeding men into. In the jungle, the fighting was close and personal in a way that naval war and aerial war are not. Naval battles happened at distances of miles, ships exchanging fire across horizons, men dying in explosions or in the open water after, sometimes never knowing exactly what hit them. But in the jungle, the enemy was close enough to hear. Close enough, sometimes, to smell. Men dug into the earth and held their positions against attacks that came at night, screaming out of the dark, and the fear was a specific, animal kind of fear, the fear of something coming toward you that you cannot fully see. Both sides fought with tremendous courage and tremendous cruelty, as men do when they are frightened and trained for war. The Japanese soldier of the Second World War had been shaped by a culture of the military that valued, above nearly everything else, the refusal to surrender. Surrender was considered shameful not just personally, but to one's family, one's ancestors, one's emperor. A prisoner of war was a man who had failed in the most fundamental obligation. This belief led to extraordinary acts of bravery. It also led to terrible suffering, because men who could not surrender could not stop fighting long past the point where fighting was rational. They fought until they died, or until the jungle and the hunger and the disease finished what bullets had not. The Americans, too, had their brutalities. The Pacific War had a racial dimension that the war in Europe did not quite have. Propaganda on both sides had worked to make the enemy less than human, and the dehumanization showed in the fighting. There were atrocities on both sides. There were acts of extraordinary mercy and decency too. War contains everything human beings are capable of, and human beings are capable of a very wide range. By February of 1943, Japan evacuated its surviving forces from Guadalcanal. What was left of them? Of the roughly 31,000 Japanese soldiers who had fought on the island, about 7,000 were evacuated. The rest were dead, roughly half killed in combat, and half dead of starvation and disease. The jungle had been as lethal as any bullet. The Americans had lost about 7,000 men as well, across all services. Though their logistical support had been better, their casualties to disease lower. They held the island. It was a turning point, though not as clean as Midway had been. Midway had been a single decisive battle. Guadalcanal was something grimmer, a slow, grinding attrition, a demonstration that the vast distances of the Pacific could be crossed and held, that American industrial production could sustain losses and keep pushing, that the momentum of Japan's early victories had stalled in the jungle mud. Let that sink quietly into the floor beneath you. The war, at this point, is something being felt on both sides, not just as battles and movements of forces, but as absence. As the letters that stopped coming. As the photographs that stayed on the mantelpiece. In Japan, the families waited. The war in the Pacific was distant even for the Japanese people at home, fought on islands most of them had never heard of, in jungles that existed only as names on maps. What reached them was filtered through government communications designed to emphasize glory and minimize the reality of loss. When the forces were withdrawn from Guadalcanal, the Japanese government announced that the troops had made a strategic advance in a different direction. There was no word, not officially, of the thousands who had starved in the dark. The families of those men received notifications that their son, their husband, their brother had died honorably in service of the emperor. The circumstances were left vague. This distance between the reality of the war and what the Japanese public was told would grow wider as the years went on, a gap filled in by propaganda, by enforced silence, by the genuine belief of many officials that the people could not be allowed to know how badly things were going, that to know would be to lose the will to continue. But people knew, in the way that people always know when things are being kept from them. They felt it in the shortages. In the men who did not come back. In the tone of voice of the radio announcer. The particular careful quality of language when something is being said around the edges of a truth. The campaign that followed Guadalcanal stretched across 2 more years and thousands of miles. Island by island, the Americans pressed northwest and west, toward Japan. The strategy had a name: island hopping. You did not need to capture every island the Japanese held. You needed to capture enough of them, the ones with airstrips, the ones that controlled sea lanes, and let the others wither, cut off from supply, their garrisons slowly starving. It was a strategy designed to minimize American casualties while maximizing Japanese ones. It was, in its way, a rational approach to the terrible mathematics of war. And it worked. Slowly, expensively, but it worked. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwek, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu. Each name, a battle. Each battle, a particular kind of hell. Saipan, in the summer of 1944, deserves a moment. Saipan was different from the purely military islands that had come before it. It was home to Japanese civilians, families who had come to the island over the previous decades as part of Japan's expansion, farmers and shopkeepers and their children, people who had built lives there. When the Americans landed in June 1944, there were roughly 20,000 Japanese civilians on the island alongside the military garrison. The battle lasted 3 weeks. The Japanese defenders fought with the now familiar ferocity, the refusal to yield. At the end, with American forces closing in on the island's northern tip, thousands of soldiers gathered for one final mass charge, a banzai charge, shouting the Emperor's name, running toward the American lines knowing they would die but choosing that death over capture. About 4,000 men died in those last hours. And then the civilians. The Japanese government had told its civilian populations, in territories that might be captured, terrible things about what the Americans would do to them. That they would be tortured. That the women would be violated. That it was better to die than to fall into American hands. Some of this was deliberate propaganda. Some of it reflected the genuine belief of men who had themselves done terrible things to captured enemies and could not imagine being treated differently. And so, at the northern cliffs of Saipan, Japanese civilians, men, women, children, whole families jumped into the sea. American sailors in the waters below called up to them, through interpreters, through gestures, tried to tell them that they would be safe, that they would not be harmed. Some people were pulled from the water and survived. But hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, chose the sea. The Americans watched and could not stop it and carried the image of it for the rest of their lives. Be gentle with yourself. Hearing this. History asks us to witness. Not to be unmoved. Being unmoved would mean something had gone wrong in us. But to witness and to breathe, and to understand that these things happened, and that they are part of the long story of what human beings do to each other and to themselves when they are caught in the machinery of war. The people on those cliffs were not soldiers. They were not combatants. They were people who had been frightened into believing they had no choice. That is one of the quieter crimes of war, the way it convinces people that the choices have already been made for them. By late 1944, Japan was losing the war. Not all Japanese people knew this. Not all Japanese leaders were willing to say it aloud. But the facts were clear to those who looked at them squarely. The empire was contracting, the Americans were advancing, the supply lines were being severed, and American submarines, a fleet of them, prowling the Pacific, were sinking Japanese merchant ships at a rate that could not be sustained. Japan was an island nation. It needed to import nearly everything. The submarines were strangling it. And now something else was coming. Something that would change the nature of the war entirely, though no one outside a small group of scientists and generals in the American desert quite knew it yet. In the skies, a new kind of aircraft had appeared, the B-29 Superfortress. Enormous, silvery, capable of flying higher and farther than almost anything Japan's defenses could reach. They had begun appearing over Japanese cities in late 1944, and their contrails, white scratches across the blue, had become a familiar and terrible sight. The people on the ground looked up at them. They could not know, yet, what was coming. Picture a city made of wood. Not wood as a metaphor. Literally wood. In 1940s Japan, the great majority of homes in Tokyo, in Osaka, in Nagoya, in Kobe were built in the traditional way. Wooden frames, wooden walls, paper screens, tiled roofs over structures that were, by the standards of a European or American city, light and close together. Streets wound between them in tight quarters, neighborhood pressed against neighborhood, the whole city a kind of dense, intricate weave. Tokyo, then called the largest city in Asia, was home to more than 6 million people. They went about their lives. They shopped at markets, rode trains, sent their children to school. The war, in its early years, had seemed distant, something happening to other people, in other places, a source of national pride and occasional grief, but not yet a weight pressing directly on daily existence. But slowly, the weight had come. By 1943 and into 1944, the shortages were real. Rice, the staple, the center of the Japanese diet, the thing around which meals were organized and families gathered, was being rationed. People received allotments. Neighborhood associations, the tonorigumi, organized distribution, kept records, reported anomalies. The associations were also a form of social surveillance, neighbors watching neighbors, collective responsibility enforced through proximity. If one family in the group violated rationing rules, the whole group might be held responsible. It bound communities together and also made them watchful of each other in ways that were not always comfortable. Meat was scarce. Sugar was scarce. Cotton was scarce. The war machine consumed resources, and what the war machine did not consume, the American submarines increasingly prevented from arriving. Ships that had once brought goods from across Asia now rested on the bottom of the Pacific. Women went to work in factories. Not by choice, exactly, the state needed labor, and the state organized it. Young women who had expected to marry and keep house found themselves in munitions plants and aircraft factories, working long shifts alongside older women and men classified as unfit for military service. The work was hard and often dangerous. There were accidents. There were chemical exposures. There was the sustained exhaustion of physical labor without adequate nutrition. And yet, in the accounts of people who lived through those years, there is something that sits alongside the hardship, a sense of solidarity, of shared purpose, of the particular strange intimacy that comes when everyone around you is suffering the same thing. Human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation, of finding meaning in difficult circumstances, of laughing at things that are not quite funny because laughter is sometimes what is left. The children. This is the part of the story that asks the most of us. Japanese school children in the wartime years were raised inside a world of profound ideological saturation. The emperor was divine. Dying for the emperor was the highest calling. The enemies were depicted in textbooks and newspapers as monstrous, subhuman, a propaganda technique that, as we have seen, was not unique to Japan, but was applied in Japan with particular systematic thoroughness. Boys of 10 and 11 drilled with bamboo spears in schoolyards. They practiced thrusting the spears at straw dummies shaped like soldiers. They were taught that when the enemy landed on the home islands, and by 1944 and 1945, this was being spoken of as an eventually rather than an impossibility, they would defend their country to the last. Bamboo spears against the American military. The gap between that image and the reality of what such a confrontation would mean was not something the children were encouraged to consider. And yet the children were also children. They played. They formed friendships. They found small pockets of ordinary life within extraordinary circumstances. A girl in Tokyo might spend her morning drilling and her afternoon helping her mother cook the thin rice porridge that had replaced proper meals, and her evening listening to the radio with her family before sleep that was increasingly interrupted as the B-29s came. The air raid alerts began in earnest in late 1944. When the sirens sounded, people were meant to go to shelters, but the shelters in Japanese cities were often inadequate. Small, poorly constructed, not designed for the kind of sustained bombardment that was coming. Families gathered in backyard trenches, in basement rooms, in whatever small dark place they had prepared. They waited, listening. The sound of a B-29 at high altitude was a particular sound. A deep, sustained drone, the sound of enormous engines carrying enormous weight across enormous distance. It was not a comforting sound. It was a sound that meant, something is about to happen, and you cannot stop it, and you do not know exactly where it will fall. The early bombing raids on Japan were high-altitude precision strikes, aimed at industrial targets. By the standards of what came later, they were relatively contained. There was damage. There were deaths. But they had not yet broken open the cities. That changed in March of 1945. But before we go to March, stay, for a moment, in the home. Because this is what is hardest to hold, and most important to hold. The war was not only battles and bombs and strategic decisions. It was also this. A family eating thin porridge around a low table. A mother telling her children that the sound in the sky is nothing to be afraid of, even though she is afraid. A father who has already been sent away, whose letters have become less frequent, whose last letter said nothing alarming and arrived 6 weeks ago. A girl writing in her diary by candlelight because the electricity has been cut again. An old man tending his small garden sweet potatoes now, where flowers used to grow, because sweet potatoes can be eaten and flowers cannot. A schoolteacher standing in front of a classroom of thin-faced children, teaching them the characters of their beautiful written language, the brushstrokes that make up words like peace, like river, like mountain, like home. These lives were real. These people were real. Every war is fought inside the lives of people who did not choose the war, who were born into a particular nation in a particular decade, who did their best with what they were given, who loved their children and their neighbors and their small daily routines, and who were about to have all of it tested in ways that are almost impossible to imagine from outside. There was a poet. Her name was Hayashi Fumiko, and she had been writing since the 1920s poems and novels about working women, about poverty, about the textures of ordinary life. By the war years she was famous, and the government sent her to the front as a correspondent, to write pieces that would support the war effort. She went. She wrote what she saw. But in her private work, in the poems she kept close, there was something else, the sadness of it, the terrible sadness, the sense of watching something being destroyed and not being able to say so plainly. She was not alone. There were many artists and writers and musicians in wartime Japan who carried a double consciousness of what was permitted to be said and what was true. The gap between those two things is its own kind of suffering. To know something that must not be spoken. To write around the shape of a truth without being able to name it. In the countryside, it was different, and in some ways harder. Japan's rural villages had already given so much. The young men had gone. Most of the military was built on farmers' sons, boys who had grown up working the land and who found themselves deposited in the jungles of New Guinea or the beaches of the Pacific Islands, places so different from the green rice paddies of home that they might have been another world. The villages that sent them waited. They held memorial services for the ones who did not return. They planted the agricultural labor on backs that were aging, on women who had not expected to do this work, on children who were old enough to pull a plow. The rice harvest of 1944 was poor. Not catastrophic, but poor. The harvest of 1945 would be worse. Japan, the island nation, was running out of time and running out of everything else. And yet, even in late 1944, even with the B-29s crossing the sky and the food running short and the letters from the front arriving less often, there were people in Japan who believed the war could still be won. Or who had convinced themselves that it could. or who simply could not allow themselves to think otherwise, because thinking otherwise meant that everything, all the sacrifice, all the dead, all the years of hardship had been for nothing. This is not stupidity. This is how human beings work. We are not well designed for accepting catastrophic loss, especially when accepting it requires abandoning the meaning we have built around the loss. To say, we are losing, and we should stop was to say, the men who died for something that is now being abandoned. The grief of that was, for many, unendurable. And so the war continued. The cherry trees bloomed in April of 1944, as they always did. In the parks, in the temple grounds, along the riversides the pale pink blossoms opened and fell, as they had done for centuries before the war and would do for centuries after. People still came to see them, still spread their blankets under the branches in the old tradition of Hanami flower viewing, the quiet practice of sitting together beneath the blossoms and acknowledging their beauty and their brevity. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics, mono no aware. It translates roughly as the pathos of things, or the gentle sadness of transience. The awareness that beautiful things pass, and that this passing is itself a kind of beauty. The cherry blossoms are the perfect symbol of it, brilliant for a week, then gone. In the spring of 1944, the blossoms fell as they always had. The people who sat beneath them knew, in some private part of themselves, that the world they had known was also falling. Quietly, petal by petal. Not yet all at once. All at once would come later. His name was Curtis LeMay. He was an American general, 38 years old, broad-faced and blunt-spoken, a man who thought about war the way an engineer thinks about a problem, as a set of variables to be optimized, a set of obstacles to be removed as efficiently as possible. He had directed the firebombing campaigns over Germany. Now he commanded the B-29 operations in the Pacific, flying from the Mariana Islands from Saipan and Tinian and Guam, the islands that had been taken at such cost the previous summer. The high-altitude precision bombing of Japanese industrial targets had not been working well. The jet stream over Japan, winds at altitude so powerful they could throw a bomber miles off course, made precision difficult. The bombs fell wide. The factories kept running. LeMay changed the approach. He would send the B-29s in low, at night. He would strip out much of their defensive armament to make room for more payload. And instead of high-explosive bombs aimed at specific buildings, he would use incendiaries, bombs designed not to blast but to burn. Against a city made of wood. The night of March 9, 1945, was clear. In Tokyo, the winter had been cold and dry, and the air that night had an edge to it. People went to sleep as they had learned to sleep in those years, with one ear open, listening for the sirens, the body never quite fully surrendering to rest. The first wave of B-29s crossed the coast of Japan shortly after midnight. There were 279 of them. They came in low, lower than bombers usually flew, low enough that the crews could feel the heat rising toward them before the night was over. They carried incendiary clusters, canisters that broke open in the air and scattered burning material across a wide area, material that stuck to whatever it touched and continued to burn, that water made worse because it scattered the burning particles rather than extinguishing them. The first bombs fell on the eastern districts of Tokyo, Asakusa, Fukagawa, Honjo. The working-class neighborhoods. The places where the houses were smallest and most tightly packed, where families lived closest together, where the streets were narrowest. The fires began. In a city of wood, fire does not stay where it starts. It moves. It spreads from roof to roof, from wall to wall, leaping across narrow streets on the wind, finding new fuel, growing. And the winds that night were not gentle. A strong northwest wind was blowing, and it caught the fires and pushed them southeast, toward the river, through district after district. The people ran. They had been told to stay and fight fires. The neighborhood associations had fire brigades, people with hand pumps and buckets, people who had practiced. But no practice had prepared anyone for this. The scale of it was beyond any prior frame. The fires were not individual burning buildings. The fires were the neighborhood. The fires were the air itself. People ran toward the rivers. The Sumida River, the Orokowa, the canals. They ran for the water because water seemed like safety, seemed like the opposite of fire. The bridges were crowded. The riverbanks were crowded. And the fires reached the riverbanks. The heat was so intense that the river water itself began to generate steam, and people who had made it to the water's edge found that the air above the water was scalding, that the heat came from all directions, that there was no direction that was not burning. Some people went into the water and stayed submerged, surfacing only for air, until the fires passed. Some survived this way. Many did not. The bombing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. When it was over, roughly 16 square miles of Tokyo had been destroyed. An area larger than the island of Manhattan, reduced in a single night to ash and ruin. The official Japanese figures said approximately 80,000 people died. Other estimates, accounting for the difficulty of counting in the chaos of the aftermath, range higher. Some historians believe 100,000 people, or more, were killed in those 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was, by some measures, the single most destructive conventional bombing raid in the history of human warfare. More deaths in one night than either of the atomic bombs that came 5 months later. Many of the dead were not identifiable afterward. The fires had been too complete. In some places, there was simply ash where a neighborhood had been. The survivors emerged at dawn into a city they did not recognize. Let me tell you what one survivor remembered. She was a woman named Ishikawa. She wrote about the experience decades later, in old age, because for years she could not speak of it. She had been 17 that night. She had run with her mother and her younger brother toward the Sumida River. At some point in the crowd and the smoke and the heat, she had lost her mother's hand. She never found her mother again. She made it to the river. She crouched on the bank with hundreds of other people and watched the city she had grown up in burn. The sky was orange and red, bright as noon, though it was 3 in the morning. The light was that complete. She said, later, that the strangest thing was the sound. She had expected screaming. There was screaming. But there was also, beneath the screaming, a kind of silence, the silence of people who had run past the point of speech, past the point of processing what was happening to them, who were simply existing in the most immediate possible way, second to second, breath to breath. She survived. Her brother survived. Her mother did not. She went on to live a long life. She had children. She had grandchildren. She did not speak about the night for many years. When she finally did, she said, "I do not know how to explain what it is to carry something like that. You carry it. That is all. You carry it and you go on. Breathe. You are not in that city. You are here, in the quiet, in the dark that is kind and not dangerous. Let the distance between you and that night be real. Let yourself be safe in it." LeMay sent the bombers back. 3 nights after Tokyo, Nagoya. 2 nights after that, Osaka. Then Kobe. Then Nagoya again. In 10 days, 5 cities, hundreds of square miles of urban Japan reduced to rubble and ash. The American crews were flying missions so frequently that they were exhausted. Some fell asleep in their aircraft on the return flights. The Japanese defense, the fighter planes that rose to meet the bombers, the anti-aircraft guns on the ground, was not capable of stopping the raids. Japan's air force had been spent. The experienced pilots were gone, lost in the battles of the previous 3 years, and the newer pilots were trained too quickly on dwindling fuel, thrown into the air in aircraft that were no match for what came against them. The cities burned. By the summer of 1945, American planners had a list of Japanese cities targeted for destruction. They crossed them off one by one as the raids proceeded. 2 cities were deliberately left off the list, held in reserve, kept intact. Their names were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were being saved for something else. In Tokyo, in the weeks after the March raid, survivors moved through rubble. Some tried to find what remained of their homes: a recognizable piece of wall, a ceramic bowl that had somehow survived, the metal clasp of a box, a twisted bicycle frame. People cling to objects in disaster. Objects are proof that something existed. That you existed here, in this place, and had a life that contained things. The government organized emergency supplies. The relief was inadequate, as emergency relief in overwhelmed systems usually is. People built shelters from debris. They cooked over open fires in the ruins. The spring came, and with it, some warmth, and the cherry blossoms opened again on the trees that had survived, because some trees had survived, roots deep enough, bark thick enough. The blossoms fell on the ash. There is no clean way to write that sentence. The blossoms fell on the ash, and people who were alive to see them saw them, and something in the seeing was unbearable and also necessary. The world continuing. Beauty persisting inside catastrophe. Not as consolation. Consolation would be too easy, too dishonest. But as fact. As the plain fact that the world is larger than any single disaster, and continues around it, and this is both devastating and, in some quiet way, sustaining. There is a word in Japanese, gaman. It means something like endurance, or patient persistence, or the bearing of what cannot be changed. It does not mean resignation exactly. It is not passive. It is the active practice of continuing, of not being broken by what tries to break you, of carrying what must be carried. The people of Tokyo practiced gaman in the spring of 1945. They had no other choice. And in having no other choice, they found, as human beings reliably do, a kind of strength they had not known they possessed. Not triumphant strength. Not the strength of people who are winning something. The quieter strength of people who are enduring. Who are still here. Who will wake tomorrow and try again. The war was not over. The Japanese government had not surrendered. Could not surrender, or believed it could not, which in this context amounts to the same thing. The military leadership still spoke of fighting on, of defending the home islands, of making any invasion so costly that the Americans would negotiate rather than conquer. The invasion plans existed on the American side too. Operation Downfall, it was called, a 2-phase landing on the Japanese home islands, planned for the autumn of 1945 and the spring of 1946. The projected casualties on both sides were enormous. Some estimates ran to hundreds of thousands of American dead. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, were projected in the millions. The cherry blossoms fell. The ash settled. And in the desert of New Mexico, a device that no one had ever used in war was being assembled, tested, readied. The people assembling it knew what it was. They did not fully know what it would mean. No one did, yet. Okinawa is a long, narrow island. It lies southwest of the Japanese mainland, roughly 340 miles from the southern tip of Kyushu. Subtropical, green, with limestone cliffs along its southern end and dense jungle in the north. The Okinawan people had their own culture, their own language related to Japanese but distinct, their own history, their own identity. They had been absorbed into the Japanese state in the 1870s and had not always been treated gently by the absorption. In the spring of 1945, they were about to become a battlefield. The American operation was called Operation Iceberg. It began on April 1, Easter Sunday, a coincidence that was noted by the men who chose the date and then perhaps regretted choosing it. The landing force was enormous, nearly 180,000 American troops, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. The naval fleet supporting them was correspondingly vast, hundreds of ships anchored in the waters around the island, a city of steel afloat in the Green Sea. The Japanese defenders numbered about 110,000. Their commander, General Ushijima Mitsuru, was a quiet, methodical man who understood the situation with clear-eyed precision. He did not expect to win. He expected to make the Americans pay so dearly for Okinawa that they would reconsider the invasion of the home islands. Every American life spent on Okinawa was, in his calculus, a life that might make a politician in Washington recalculate. He pulled his forces back from the beaches, let the Americans land without opposition, and waited in prepared defensive positions in the south. The battle lasted 82 days. It was the longest and most costly battle of the Pacific Campaign. By the time it was over, roughly 12,000 Americans were dead, and somewhere between 110,000 and 120,000 Japanese soldiers, nearly the entire defending force. And among the Okinawan civilians caught between them, somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 dead. The range is wide because the chaos was total, because the distinction between military and civilian deaths dissolved in the fighting, because some civilian deaths were never recorded by anyone. In the south of the island, in the limestone cave systems, Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians sheltered together in the dark. When American forces sealed the cave entrances, threw in smoke grenades, called through interpreters for surrender, what happened varied from cave to cave. In some, people surrendered and survived. In others, soldiers killed the civilians to prevent them surrendering, or civilians took their own lives, as on Saipan. The same terrible logic, the same propaganda, the same unbearable outcome. Ushijima died on June 22 by ritual suicide, sitting on a cliff overlooking the sea he had failed to protect. He faced the imperial palace, far to the north. His last written words thanked his soldiers for their service. He is remembered in Japan with a complicated kind of reverence, a man who was correct about his own defeat and chose to meet it on his own terms. But the thing that haunted the sailors offshore, the thing that entered the nightmares of the men who survived and followed them home across decades, was not the land battle. It was the sky. The operation had a name that was, in Japanese, quite beautiful: kikusu. Floating chrysanthemum. The chrysanthemum is the flower of the imperial household, the 16-petaled bloom that appears on the seal of the emperor, on official documents, on the crests of warships. To call it floating was to invoke the image of a flower drifting on water, loose from its stem, moving with the current. The floating chrysanthemums were the kamikazes. The word kamikaze means divine wind. It comes from the typhoons that, in the 13th century, had twice destroyed the Mongol fleets sailing to invade Japan, storms that the Japanese understood as the hand of heaven protecting them. In 1944, as the war turned decisively against Japan and the shortage of experienced pilots made conventional aerial combat increasingly hopeless, the military began formally organizing what had previously been individual acts. Pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into enemy ships. The logic was this: a trained pilot had perhaps a 10% chance of hitting a moving ship with a bomb dropped conventionally. A pilot who became the bomb could hit with near certainty. One life, one ship. The mathematics were, in the cold language of military planning, favorable. The young men who volunteered, and they were, at first, volunteers, came from universities, from towns and farms and fishing villages across Japan. Some were barely 20. Some were younger. They wrote letters before their final flights. These letters have been preserved, and they are among the most difficult documents of the Second World War to read, not because they are full of hate or bloodlust, which they mostly are not, but because they are so recognizably human. They write to their mothers, "Please do not grieve too much." They write to their younger brothers, "Study hard, be good to our parents." They write about the cherry blossoms, as the Japanese always write about the cherry blossoms, brief and beautiful, the falling accepted, the impermanence embraced. One pilot, 22 years old, a student of literature before the war, wrote, "I am not afraid. I am sad. These are different things. I am sad because there is much I did not get to do, and much I will not see. But I am not afraid, because I know what I am flying toward, and I have made my peace with it." He was 22. He flew the next morning and did not return. The psychological reality of what the American sailors experienced during the Okinawa campaign is something that took decades to fully surface. The kamikazes came in waves of kikusu attacks, numbered 1 through 10 over the course of the campaign. Hundreds of aircraft in each wave, mixed with conventional attackers to complicate the defense. The sailors on the radar picket ships, destroyers stationed far out from the fleet to give early warning, were the first targets. These ships were savagely hit, again and again. Some were sunk. Others survived damage that should have sunk them. The men aboard learned to live inside a particular kind of sustained terror, the knowledge that the weapon coming toward them was a man who had already decided to die, who could not be discouraged or frightened off, who would not pull away at the last moment. A conventional pilot might flinch. A kamikaze would not. In 36 ships sunk and hundreds damaged, nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed by kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign alone. And for the young men in the aircraft, most of them did not sink ships. Most were shot down before they reached their targets by anti-aircraft fire, by fighter interceptors, by the weight of the defensive systems the Americans had built around the fleet. They died, most of them, without completing what they had set out to do. Sacrificed, in the end, without even the consolation of the impact they had been promised. The ones who did strike their targets, the sailors who saw them coming in those final seconds and could not stop them, described the same thing. The surreal quality of watching something you know is a human being, in the cockpit of an aircraft, choosing not to pull away. The gap between that knowledge and the explosion that followed. Breathe with me for a moment. There is no clean way to feel about the kamikazes. The young men in the aircraft were not monsters. They were people who had been shaped by years of ideology, by the culture of sacrifice they had grown up inside, by the pressure of a state at war that had made this ask of them. Many of them were frightened. Many of them believed, genuinely, that what they were doing was right and necessary. Many of them were also, simply, too young to fully understand that the choice being offered to them was not truly a choice. And the men on the ships who watched them come, they were also people. They were also frightened. They also did not choose the situation they were in. War asks people to be the worst and the best of themselves simultaneously, and it is often impossible, afterward, to separate which was which. By the end of June 1945, Okinawa was in American hands. The fighting that had begun on Easter Sunday ended in the crushing heat of a subtropical summer, in the rubble of ancient Okinawan towns, in cave mouths sealed by combat, in the exhaustion of men who had been fighting for over 2 months and had seen things that would not leave them. The American military planners looked at Okinawa and updated their estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The numbers grew. Japan was preparing its civilian population to fight. There were, genuinely, plans to arm the population with bamboo spears and agricultural tools, to organize the women and the elderly and the children into defense units. The ideology that had produced the kamikaze was being scaled up, applied to an entire nation. The invasion, if it came, would be Okinawa multiplied across hundreds of miles of coastline, across cities and towns and mountain passes, across a people who had been told that surrender was worse than death. The people who had to make the decision about whether to invade looked at those numbers, and they looked at another option that was being prepared in the New Mexico desert, and they made the choice that history records. Whether it was the right choice or whether any of the choices made in those years were the right choices is something that cannot be settled in a story told for falling asleep, or perhaps anywhere. It is a question that historians and philosophers and the descendants of the people involved have been sitting with for 80 years, and will sit with for 80 more. What we can say is this: the choice was made. And what came next came. Hiroshima is a city on the western shore of Honshu, Japan's largest island. It sits on a river delta, 6 rivers, actually, branching from the Ota River as it meets the Seto Inland Sea, spreading across flat land in a gentle fan. The city had grown up on those river channels, crossed by bridges, its neighborhoods arranged on the flat ground between the water. It was, by the standards of Japanese cities in the summer of 1945, relatively intact. The American bombers had not yet targeted it in any serious way. The people who lived there were aware of this, and aware of why. The city was on the list of targets being held in reserve. They did not know for what. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Hiroshima had a population of somewhere between 340,000 and 350,000 people. The city was also home to a significant military garrison. It was a regional headquarters, and soldiers moved through its streets alongside the civilians who had lived there all their lives. It was a Monday. Warm, with a clear sky. The kind of morning that, in peacetime, people would have called beautiful. The aircraft was called the Enola Gay. It was a B-29, silver in the morning light, flying at 31,000 feet. Its pilot was Colonel Paul Tibbets, who had named the plane after his mother. There were 12 men aboard. They had been briefed on what they were carrying, though the full reality of it, the full reality of anything that has never been done before, is not something a briefing can entirely convey. The bomb in the aircraft's hold was called Little Boy. It was 10 feet long and weighed nearly 10,000 pounds. Its mechanism was simple by the standards of what came after a gun-type device that fired one piece of enriched uranium into another, reaching critical mass, initiating a chain reaction of nuclear fission. It had never been tested in this configuration. The scientists at Los Alamos were confident it would work. They were correct. At 8:15 in the morning, over the center of Hiroshima, the bomb fell. For 43 seconds, it fell through the clear air, the city spread below it on its river delta, ordinary and unknowing. Then it detonated, at an altitude of approximately 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic, almost exactly at the intended aiming point, the AIOI bridge. What happened in the next seconds is something that physics can describe and human language struggles to contain. The fireball reached a temperature of several million degrees. The pressure wave expanded outward at the speed of sound. Within a mile of the detonation point, the hypocenter, the place directly below the explosion, almost everything was destroyed instantly. Buildings were not burned, they were erased. People were not killed, they were simply gone, their shadows burned into the stone steps where they had been sitting, impressions left in the surfaces of things, the only evidence that a moment before someone had been there. Further out, the blast wave arrived a second or two after the light. The light came first, a flash of brightness so absolute that people miles away were temporarily blinded, that birds dropped from the sky, that a woman hanging laundry in her garden 3 miles from the hypocenter saw the world go white and felt the heat on her face like an open furnace and threw herself to the ground not knowing what had happened to the sun. Then the pressure wave. Buildings collapsed. Glass became projectiles. People were thrown from their feet, from their bicycles, from the streetcars that had been running their morning routes through the city. Then fire. As in Tokyo, but concentrated, intensified. The thermal pulse had ignited everything combustible across a wide area simultaneously, and the fires merged into a firestorm, a single massive fire that generated its own wind, drawing air inward from all directions to feed itself. The survivors, the hibakusha, as they came to be called, the bomb-affected people, walked out of the center of the city. They walked in lines, some of them, following each other toward the rivers, arms extended at their sides because the skin on their arms had been burned, and they had learned, already in those first minutes, that letting the skin touch itself caused a pain beyond description. Their clothes, in many cases, had been burned away. Their hair. In the hypocenter's immediate vicinity, people had simply ceased to exist. A little further out, people were alive but transformed by what had happened to them in ways that would take hours, or days, or weeks to fully manifest. Radiation does not announce itself. You cannot feel it entering you. A person who has received a lethal dose of radiation may feel, in the immediate aftermath, relatively unharmed. They may help others. They may walk to a shelter, drink water, speak to their family. The damage is done invisibly, to the cells, and what it does to the cells takes time to become apparent. In the days after August 6th, people who had seemed unharmed began to die. Their hair fell out. Their gums bled. They developed fevers that would not break, wounds that would not heal. The white blood cells that the body uses to fight infection had been destroyed or disrupted. The immune system had been dismantled at the cellular level. There was, in the medical understanding of 1945, almost nothing that could be done. Her name was Sasaki Sadako. She was 2 years old on August 6, 1945. Her home was less than a mile from the hypocenter. She survived the blast, a miracle, or what felt like one. She grew up, went to school, ran on the track team, was fast and healthy and full of life. When she was 11, she was diagnosed with leukemia. Radiation-induced leukemia, the doctors understood. A delayed consequence of what had passed through her small body 9 years before. There is a Japanese legend that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, you may be granted a wish. Sadako began folding cranes in the hospital. She folded 644 before she died, at the age of 12. Her classmates folded the rest. She is buried with 1,000 cranes. A statue of her stands in Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, a girl holding a crane above her head, the bronze figure at the center of the park that was built on the ground where the hypocenter had been. Children from across Japan, and from across the world, send paper cranes to Hiroshima. Millions of them, every year. Strung in long colorful chains around the statue. 12 years old. The Enola Gay landed back at Tinian Island at 2:58 in the afternoon. The crew was met by a crowd of generals, photographers, men with cameras and clipboards. There were medals. There were handshakes. Tibbets was given the Distinguished Service Cross on the tarmac, the medal pinned to his flight suit while the cameras clicked. Some of the crew celebrated. Some were quieter. The tail gunner, a young man named Robert Caron, had watched the mushroom cloud rise behind the departing aircraft and had tried to describe it in his log in real time, reaching for words for something no one had words for yet. In interviews given decades later, the men of the Enola Gay spoke about that day in ways that were complicated and various. Some expressed no regret, believed the bomb had ended the war and saved lives on both sides that an invasion would have cost. Some grew quieter over the years. Some stopped speaking about it. Tibbets, until his death in 2007, maintained that he had done what was necessary and would do it again. He had requested, in his will, that there be no funeral and no headstone. He did not want the grave to become a site of protest. He was cremated, and his ashes scattered over the English Channel. A man who changed the world, and did not want a place to be remembered. In Hiroshima, in the hours and days after the bomb, help was slow to come. The communication lines were destroyed. The military could not understand, at first, what had happened. Reconnaissance aircraft reported that the city appeared to have been destroyed, but by what was not immediately clear. Rescue trains from outside the city arrived and found the tracks blocked by rubble. The hospitals that still functioned were overwhelmed beyond any capacity to function properly. Doctors and nurses who had survived, many had not worked in ruined buildings, with almost no supplies, on patients whose injuries were like nothing in any medical training. They did what they could. What they could do was not much. The city that had existed on the morning of August 6th, its bridges, its schools, its markets, its temple, its thousands of ordinary homes was, within a radius of roughly 2 miles from the hypocenter, gone. Not damaged. Gone. By the end of 1945, the death toll from the Hiroshima bomb, immediate deaths and those caused by radiation illness in the months following, was estimated at between 90,000 and 166,000 people. In a single bomb. Dropped from a single aircraft. In 43 seconds of falling. The world had changed. Not only Japan's world, though Japan's world had changed utterly. The world itself, the nature of what nations could do to each other, the ceiling of violence that human ingenuity had always been raising and had now raised to a place no one had imagined, had changed. Albert Einstein, whose famous letter to President Roosevelt in 1939 had helped initiate the American nuclear program, said afterward, "Had I known that the Germans would not succeed in developing the atomic bomb, I never would have lifted a finger." He spent the rest of his life working for nuclear disarmament. Robert Oppenheimer, who had directed the Manhattan Project, who had watched the first test detonation in New Mexico and quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death," the destroyer of worlds, spent years afterward in anguish, working against the proliferation of the weapons he had helped create. Until the government stripped him of his security clearance during the Red Scare of the 1950s and removed him from the conversation. The men who built the bomb understood, in many cases with terrible clarity, what they had done. The Ota River still runs through Hiroshima. The 6 channels still spread across the delta, still meet the Seto Inland Sea. The city was rebuilt slowly, painfully, across the years after the war. New buildings rose where the old ones had been erased. New generations were born who had not been there. In the Peace Memorial Park, the atomic bomb dome still stands, the ruin of the Industrial Promotion Hall, one of the few structures near the hypocenter that remained partially upright, its iron frame exposed, its walls partially intact. It was decided, after long debate, to leave it standing. As a witness. As the thing that cannot be explained away or rebuilt over. It stands there still. The river runs past it. The cranes turned slowly in the wind. Sadako's cranes. The world's cranes. 1,000, and 1,000 more. August 6, 1945. Late afternoon. In Tokyo, the first reports were fragmentary and confused. A city had been destroyed, that much was clear. Communication lines from Hiroshima had gone silent simultaneously, which meant the damage had been total. Reconnaissance aircraft were sent. They returned with photographs that the people looking at them could not immediately process. What weapon does this? The answer came from the Americans. President Truman, aboard the cruiser Augusta in the middle of the Atlantic, returning from the Potsdam Conference in Germany, released a statement. The United States had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. If Japan did not surrender, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air unlike anything seen on Earth. The statement reached Japan. The military leadership, the Supreme War Council, the cabinet, the men who had been running the war read it and convened. What happened in those rooms, over those 3 days, is one of the most consequential and painful deliberations in modern history. The Japanese government in August of 1945 was not a unified thing. It was a collection of competing factions, military and civilian, each with their own understanding of the situation and their own sense of what honor and survival required. The military leadership, and in Japan, in 1945, the military had enormous power over the civilian government. More than the reverse was divided between those who understood the war was lost and those who could not or would not accept it. The faction that could not accept it had a plan. It was called Ketsugo Operation Decisive. The plan for the defense of the home islands. Every man, every woman who could hold a weapon, every child old enough to run, organized into a last defense. The military had been dispersing aircraft and fuel, hiding them from American bombing, preserving them for the invasion they believed was coming. They had assembled thousands of small fishing boats, wooden craft loaded with explosives, to be driven by volunteers into the hulls of American landing ships. The logic was the same logic that had driven the kamikazes, applied now to an entire people. Make the cost of invasion so high that the Americans would negotiate, would accept a settlement that did not require unconditional surrender, would allow Japan to retain something its structure of government, the emperor, some shred of the thing that had been. The war faction was willing to sacrifice millions of Japanese lives for that shred. There were others who were not. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori had been arguing for months, quietly and at considerable personal risk, that the war should be ended through negotiation. He had been reaching out to the Soviet Union, who were not yet in the Pacific War, as a possible intermediary. He believed that a negotiated peace, even one that required significant concessions, was infinitely preferable to what was coming. And then, on August 8, the second day after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The news arrived like a second blow. Japan had been counting on Soviet neutrality, had been hoping the Soviets might mediate. Instead, Soviet forces crossed the border into Manchuria, moving against the Japanese army there with overwhelming numbers and speed. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Japanese military, had been stripped of its best units over the years, sent to the Pacific, and what remained was no match for the Soviet advance. In 48 hours, 2 catastrophes: the atomic bomb and the Soviet entry into the war. The calculation of the war faction that Japan could hold out, could make invasion too costly, was becoming visibly, undeniably untenable. And still, in the Supreme War Council, the war faction would not concede. The second bomb was not inevitable. This is something historians continue to discuss. The decision to drop a second bomb, only 3 days after the first, is more contested than the decision to drop the first. Some argue that 3 days was not enough time for the Japanese government to process what had happened and formulate a surrender, that the political process, the internal debates, the weight of the decision would have taken longer, and that patience might have produced the same result without Nagasaki. Others argue that the Japanese military's refusal to concede, even after Hiroshima and the Soviet entry, demonstrated that only continued overwhelming pressure would produce a surrender, and that the alternative to the second bomb was not a diplomatic resolution but an invasion, with casualties measured not in thousands but in millions. There is no clean answer. The people who made the decision believed what they believed and operated with the knowledge they had. The people who suffered the consequences had no say in the decision at all. Nagasaki. The city sits on the western coast of Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island, a harbor city, long and narrow, tucked between green hills that run down to the water. For centuries it had been Japan's primary window to the outside world, the one port where foreign traders, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Chinese, were permitted to do business during Japan's long period of self-imposed isolation. It was, because of this history, a cosmopolitan city, a place of mingling and exchange. It had one of the largest Christian communities in Japan, descendants of the converts made by Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century, a faith maintained across generations of persecution, practiced quietly and privately through the long centuries when Christianity had been forbidden. In the hills above the harbor, the Urakami Cathedral stood, the largest Catholic cathedral in Asia. It had been completed in 1925, 30 years of community labor, built by the Urakami Christians as an expression of a faith that had survived everything. On August 9, 1945, the bomb fell. The aircraft was called Boxcar. Its pilot was Major Charles Sweeney. The bomb was called Fat Man, a different design from Little Boy, a plutonium implosion device, rounder and more complex. The primary target that day was not Nagasaki. It was Kokura, a city to the northeast. But when Boxcar reached Kokura, the city was covered in clouds and smoke from American bombing of a nearby city the previous day. Sweeney circled 3 times. The bombardier could not get a visual fix. By regulations, they could not drop without visual confirmation of the target. They flew to the secondary target. Nagasaki was also partly cloudy. They circled. They had limited fuel. And then, for 45 seconds, the clouds opened. The bomb fell. It detonated at 11:02 in the morning, at an altitude of about 1,650 feet, approximately 1.5 miles from the intended aiming point. The hills had compressed the blast in some directions, channeled it in others. The Urakami Valley, where the Christian community had lived for generations, was in the direct path. The Urakami Cathedral was destroyed. The community that had built it, that had maintained its faith across centuries of persecution and isolation, was devastated. Thousands of Nagasaki's Christians were killed in the seconds after the bomb fell, a particular, terrible irony that has not been lost in the decades since. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people died in Nagasaki on August 9 and in the weeks that followed. Fewer than Hiroshima, in part because of the hills that confined the blast, in part because the bomb missed its intended aiming point. Fewer. And yet, a man named Yamahata Yosuke was a military photographer sent to Nagasaki the day after the bomb. He spent a day walking through the ruined city with his camera, photographing what he found. His photographs are among the most important documents of the atomic bombings, not the photographs of the mushroom cloud, taken from a distance, but the photographs of the ground, of people wandering in the rubble, of a mother holding a child, of a boy eating rice beside a collapsed building, of the simply ordinary texture of people continuing to exist in a place that had been unmade. Yamahata himself died in 1966, of cancer. He was 48 years old. Breathe. Stay with me. Something I want to name, here, before we move forward. These two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have become, in the decades since, symbols. Which is right. But there is a risk in symbolization, which is that the symbol can replace the people. That Hiroshima becomes a concept, a reference point in arguments about war and nuclear weapons, and the person who was eating breakfast on a Monday morning in August becomes a statistic, a data point in the concept. The woman who threw herself to the ground when the light came, She was real. Sadako, folding her cranes. She was real. The Urakami Christians, 300 years of hidden faith, the cathedral they built with their hands, real. Hold the people alongside the history. That is all I am asking. On the evening of August 9th, the Supreme War Council met again. 3 of its 6 members wanted to continue the war. 3 wanted to seek peace. A tie. Under Japanese governmental procedure, a tied Supreme War Council could not make a recommendation to the cabinet. The war might have continued indefinitely in procedural deadlock. Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro made an extraordinary decision. He took the deadlock to the emperor. This was not, in the protocol of the Japanese state, how things were supposed to work. The emperor ratified decisions. He did not make them, not in any practical, active sense, not in the modern governance of the country. He was consulted, informed, his approval sought. But to bring him a deadlocked decision and ask him to resolve it, this was different. This was asking the divine to intervene in the human. Emperor Hirohito, in a room in the imperial palace in the middle of the night, spoke. He said that he wished to accept the Allied terms. He said that he had considered carefully the current situation at home and abroad, and that he saw no possibility of continuing the war. He said that the thought of those who had died in service of Japan was unbearable to him, that he could not bear to see more of his people die. He wept, it is recorded, as he spoke. The men in the room wept. It was not, even then, over. There were men in the military who would not accept it, who attempted, in the days that followed, a coup, an effort to seize the imperial palace, to intercept the recording the emperor was making of his surrender announcement, to prevent it from being broadcast. The coup failed, but narrowly. It required the personal intervention of loyal officers to suppress. History, at its hinges, is often narrower than it looks from the outside. August 15, 1945. In Japan, it is called Shusen Kanenbi, the day commemorating the end of the war. Or sometimes, more plainly, Haisen, the day of defeat. The language people choose, even now, says something about how they carry it. The recording had been made 2 days earlier, on the night of August 14th, in a small room in the Imperial Household Ministry. Emperor Hirohito sat before a microphone, a formal, unfamiliar technology for a man whose existence had been defined by ceremony and distance, and read a prepared text. It was written in classical Japanese, formal and archaic, the language of court documents and imperial proclamations, not the language of ordinary speech. When it was broadcast the next day, many of his subjects would struggle to understand every word. But they would understand the meaning. The recording was made twice, because the emperor was not satisfied with the first take. The 2 acetate discs, fragile and irreplaceable, were then hidden by palace staff in a laundry basket among the women's quarters of the palace, to protect them from the coup attempt already underway. Officers loyal to the faction that refused to surrender were moving through the palace, searching for the recording, intending to destroy it before it could be broadcast. They did not find it. At noon on August 15, 1945, radios across Japan crackled to life. An announcer asked listeners to stand, if they were able. Many knelt, instead the formal posture of respect, the position one assumed before something sacred. Then the voice came. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard the emperor speak. He had been a presence in their lives, not as a voice but as an image of photographs, woodblock prints, the formal portrait that hung in schools and government offices, a man on a white horse, remote and divine. His voice, when it came, was high and thin, formal and strange, reading in that archaic language that felt like it came from another century. He spoke for 4 minutes and 24 seconds. He did not use the word surrender. The document had been crafted with enormous care. Every word considered. The emperor and his advisors understood that what he was saying was so far outside any prior Japanese experience that it needed to be said in a way that people could receive it without the word itself shattering something irreparably. He spoke of the war having developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He spoke of the enemy having begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. He said that to continue the war would lead to the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. And then he said, "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable." Enduring the unendurable. Suffering what is unsufferable. The word he used for enduring Tairu is related to gaman, that quality of patient persistence we spoke of earlier. To bear what must be borne. He was asking his people to do, at the largest possible scale, what they had been doing in their own small ways throughout the war, to continue. To not be broken. To survive what survival required. The people listening knelt in the wreckage of their lives and wept. In the cities that had been bombed, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and now Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they knelt in the rubble. In the countryside, in villages that had been spared the bombing but not the grief of the men who had not come home, they knelt in their fields and their kitchens. On the fronts in the Pacific, in China, in Manchuria, in the jungles of Southeast Asia where soldiers were still fighting, some men heard it on the radio and put down their weapons and wept, and others did not hear it at all and kept fighting, and some would keep fighting for years, hiding in jungles that they did not know the war had left behind. The weeping was not simple. Some wept with relief, a relief so profound it felt like the lifting of a physical weight, the end of the unbearable sustained tension of the years of war. Some wept with grief for the dead, for the wasted years, for everything that had been lost and could not be recovered. Some wept with shame, not personal shame, exactly, but the shame of defeat, the collapse of a story that had been told about Japan's destiny and Japan's strength and Japan's divine protection. Some wept with anger, though the anger was often turned inward, or not yet sorted out, not yet legible as anger. In some places, soldiers killed themselves rather than accept the surrender. Officers of the war faction, men who had built their lives around the ideology that defeat was unacceptable, found that they were now being asked to accept it, and could not. A small number of high-ranking officers performed ritual suicide on the palace grounds, facing the imperial household. In Atsugi, a naval airbase outside Tokyo, a young commander named Kozono Yasuna refused to transmit the ceasefire order to his pilots. He had his aircraft fueled and armed, preparing to continue the war by himself if necessary, and spent several days in a kind of manic defiance before his own officers, concerned about his mental state, relieved him of command. He was later hospitalized. History contains these figures, the ones for whom the new reality is simply too much, who live in the old story until the old story can no longer sustain them. They are not incomprehensible. They are, in their way, a testament to how deeply the war had structured everything, how thoroughly it had become the only frame available. The formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945. The ceremony took place on the deck of the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The morning was overcast, the bay grey and still. Representatives of the Japanese government and military boarded the ship and signed the instrument of surrender at a table covered with a green felt cloth, surrounded by Allied officers and officials from every nation that had fought against Japan. General Douglas MacArthur presided. He spoke briefly, asking that peace be maintained, that a better world emerge from what had been endured. His words were recorded and broadcast. Then the Japanese representatives signed. Mamoru Shigemitsu, the foreign minister, signing for the government. His leg was artificial. He had lost the original in a bombing attack years before, and he struggled briefly with the steps up to the signing table, and an American general reached out and steadied him, and the gesture was small and human and entirely outside the formality of the moment, and it was the kind of thing that stays in the memory. The war, officially, was over. In Japan, the days that followed the emperor's broadcast had a particular quality that survivors describe with the word kaidatsu. Prostration. Collapse. Not the dramatic collapse of buildings, but the interior collapse of people who had been holding themselves upright under enormous pressure for years, and who no longer had anything to hold themselves against. The energy that had been directed at the war, at working in the factories, at growing food in every available plot, at maintaining the 1,000 daily disciplines of life in a nation at war had nowhere to go. People Saturday. People stared. The usual patterns of daily life seemed, suddenly, absurd, not wrong, but absurd in the way that routine always seems absurd immediately after something enormous. Food was desperately short. The infrastructure of the country's railways, roads, and ports had been badly damaged. The cities were in ruins. The economy was in ruins. The moral and ideological framework that had organized Japanese society for decades was suddenly, completely, discredited. The emperor was not divine, the military had not protected the nation, the sacrifice had not been sufficient, the war had been lost. What do you build when the ground you were standing on turns out to have been paper? General MacArthur arrived in Japan on August 30, 1945. He flew into Atsugi Air Base, the same base where Kozono had refused the ceasefire order, and stepped off the aircraft into a Japan that had never been occupied by a foreign power. In all its recorded history, Japan had never been invaded, never been occupied. The thought of it had been used as a motivation throughout the war. The Americans would come and take everything, would violate everything sacred, would destroy what Japan was. MacArthur drove through the streets of Tokyo in an open car. The streets were lined with Japanese soldiers, their backs to the road, the traditional position of ceremonial respect, also a practical precaution against the possibility of a rogue soldier taking a shot at the arriving general. The crowds were silent. People watched from doorways and windows. It was not the silence of hostility, exactly, or not only. It was the silence of people witnessing something they had no prior category for. The occupation had begun. And the occupation, contrary to the propaganda that had told Japanese people to fear it, would, over the years that followed, become something unexpected. A genuine and complicated partnership in the rebuilding of a country. Not without its own injustices, its own impositions, its own exercises of power. But also, genuinely, a reconstruction. A transformation. Japan was about to become something it had never been. The winter of 1945 was very hard. Japan had been preparing for invasion, not for peace. The emergency food reserves, the fuel stockpiles, the material resources that might have eased the transition, most of them had been committed to the war effort, hidden away for the battle that never came. And now the war was over, and the reserves were depleted, and the cities were in ruins, and approximately 3 million Japanese people were dead, and 8 million more were homeless. The people who had survived gathered what they could. In Tokyo, in the vast flattened districts where the firebombing had done its work, people built shelters from salvaged debris, sheets of corrugated iron propped against standing walls, scraps of wood assembled into rooms barely large enough to sleep in. They sold whatever they owned that could be sold. Black markets appeared in the ruins of every major city, outdoor markets where soldiers returning from overseas, factory workers, families, anyone with something to exchange, gathered to trade food and clothing and the small necessities of life that the official economy could not provide. The black markets were, technically, illegal. The occupation authorities largely tolerated them, understanding that without them people would simply starve. Necessity creates its own permissions. MacArthur established his headquarters in the Daiichi Building in central Tokyo, a modern office building that had survived the bombing, across the plaza from the Imperial Palace moat. Every morning he drove from his residence to the office, and every morning a small crowd gathered to watch him pass. Not to protest, not to celebrate, simply to watch. To see the man who now, in practical terms, governed their country. The occupation MacArthur directed was called SCAP Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. It was, in its ambitions, one of the most extraordinary experiments in political transformation in modern history. The goal was not merely to disarm Japan and extract reparations, though those things happened too, but to remake Japanese society from the ground up. To build, in a country that had never had one, a functioning liberal democracy. The new constitution was drafted largely by Americans, in a week, in February of 1946. It was a remarkable document, and its most remarkable provision was Article 9, the clause by which Japan renounced war forever. Not as a tactical concession, not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent constitutional commitment. Japan would not maintain military forces capable of offensive warfare. Japan would resolve its international disputes by peaceful means. It was, in some sense, the most explicit anti-war statement ever written into a national constitution. The Japanese government accepted it. Some did so reluctantly, understanding the circumstances. Others accepted it with something like relief, as if the prohibition said out loud what many had privately felt, that the path Japan had taken had led somewhere no one should go again. The war crimes trials began in 1946. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, sometimes called the Tokyo Trials, convened in the same building where the Japanese military had once planned its campaigns. 28 senior military and political leaders were tried. 7 were hanged, including former Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, who had authorized the attack on Pearl Harbor. The trials were imperfect, as such trials always are. The victors judging the defeated, the categories of international law stretched to cover actions that had not been clearly illegal when committed, the selection of defendants that sometimes reflected politics as much as culpability. The emperor himself was not tried by a deliberate decision by MacArthur, who believed that prosecuting Hirohito would destabilize the occupation and make reconstruction impossible. Whether this was wisdom or a failure of justice has been argued ever since. What the trials did accomplish imperfectly, partially, was public accounting. A naming of what had been done. The evidence presented, the testimony given, the records examined. These things entered the historical record and could not be unentered. The mass killings in Nanjing. The treatment of prisoners of war. The forced labor. The experiments conducted in Manchuria by Unit 731 on human subjects are perhaps the most disturbing record of the entire war, the systematic use of prisoners for biological and chemical weapons research. These things were said aloud, in a courtroom, with the world watching. But in the streets of the ruined cities, the trials were distant. What was immediate was food, work, shelter, the daily business of continuing. The American occupation brought aid not generously enough, and not without its own self-interest, but genuinely. Food shipments, medical supplies, the infrastructure repairs that allowed trains to run and ports to function. Children who had been eating grass soup and sweet potato vines began, slowly, to eat better. Slowly. A generation of Japanese children grew up in those post-war years with a particular experience. The experience of watching their country change around them, completely and rapidly, in ways that no prior generation had navigated. The militarist ideology that had saturated their schoolbooks was literally cut out teachers going through textbooks with scissors and black ink, removing the passages about imperial destiny and the glory of dying for the emperor, leaving blank spaces on the page. Blank spaces on the page. The children read around them. They learned, from new textbooks, new things about democracy, about rights, about a different understanding of what Japan was and what it could be. And they learned this while also learning, from their parents and grandparents and the rubble still visible in their cities, what the old understanding had cost. That double knowledge, the blank spaces and the rubble, shaped a generation in ways that are still visible in Japan today. The economy began to recover, slowly at first, and then with a speed that surprised the world. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was part of it. Japan became a staging ground and supply base for American forces, and the contracts and purchases that flowed through the Japanese economy provided a significant stimulus. It was a strange irony, a war on the Korean peninsula, itself a consequence of the geopolitical restructuring that Japan's defeat had helped produce, helping to rebuild the Japanese economy. But it was not only the Korean War. It was also the Japanese people themselves, the same capacity for organization and collective effort and sustained hard work that the war had channeled into destruction, now channeled into production. The factories that remained were rebuilt and modernized. New industries grew. Engineers and scientists who had been working on aircraft and weapons turned their skills to transistor radios, to cameras, to motorcycles, to the technologies of peacetime. By the 1960s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. By the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, held in a city that had been ash 19 years before, Japan presented itself to the world as something new. The Shinkansen, the bullet train, began service the week before the Olympics opened, running from Tokyo to Osaka at speeds the world had not seen on rails. The opening ceremony was a vision of modernity and order and peaceful ambition, watched by hundreds of millions of people around the globe. 19 years from ash to the bullet train. Human beings, given the choice, will choose to build. The survivors of the atomic bombs occupied a complicated place in the new Japan. They carried their survival in their bodies. The radiation effects were ongoing, elevated rates of cancer, of leukemia, of thyroid disorders, appearing across their lifetimes, each diagnosis a continuation of what had happened in a moment in August 1945. And they carried their survival in their social lives in complicated ways too. There was, in the early post-war years, a stigma attached to having been in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Fear of radiation, imperfectly understood, led some people to avoid the survivors, to worry about contamination, to regard them as marked in some way. Some survivors hid their experience, did not tell employers, did not tell potential spouses, did not speak of what they had seen or what they carried. Others became witnesses and made the deliberate choice to tell their stories, to speak to school groups and community organizations and international audiences, to carry the knowledge of what they had survived into the world precisely because it needed to be there. Setsuko Thurlow was 13 years old when the bomb fell on Hiroshima. She survived. She spent her adult life as a disarmament activist, eventually becoming a central figure in the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. She stood on the stage in Oslo at the Nobel ceremony, 95 years old, white-haired and clear-eyed, and spoke about the girl she had been in the rubble and about the world she was still trying to build. The girl in the rubble. The woman on the stage in Oslo. One life. What a life contains. Something I want you to hold as you drift towards sleep. The same country that produced the attack on Pearl Harbor, the march through Nanjing, the kamikazes, and the bamboo spears, and the ideology that told its people their lives were worth spending, that same country, in the space of a single generation, became something genuinely different. Not perfect. No country is perfect. But different. Committed, constitutionally and culturally, to peace. One of the most pacifist populations on Earth, in polling and in practice. A country that has not fired a shot in war since 1945. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, extraordinary. It does not erase what came before. History does not work like an eraser. But it sits alongside what came before, and the two things together, the depth of the darkness and the distance traveled from it, say something worth hearing about what human beings and human societies are capable of. We are capable of the worst. We are also capable of this. The cherry trees still bloom every spring in Japan. In Hiroshima, they bloom in the Peace Memorial Park, around the atomic bomb dome, along the banks of the Ota River. Families spread their blankets in the old tradition of hanami flower viewing and sit beneath the branches and watch the petals fall. Children run between the trees. Old people sit quietly and watch the children run. The petals fall into the river and float downstream, pale and brief, toward the sea. Mono no aware. The gentle sadness of things passing. The beauty that is inseparable from transience. The awareness that this moment, exactly this moment, will not come again, and that this is not only loss, but also gift. The people who survived the worst that the 20th century could produce looked at the cherry blossoms and found them still beautiful. That, too, is something worth knowing. There is a temple in Kyoto called Ryoanji. It was built in the 15th century, on the grounds of an aristocratic villa, and it is famous for its rock garden, a rectangle of raked white gravel, 15 stones arranged in 5 groups, surrounded by a low earthen wall. The garden is not large. You could cross it in a few steps. But you are not meant to cross it. You are meant to sit at its edge, on the wooden veranda of the temple, and look. The 15 stones are arranged so that from any position along the veranda, one stone is always hidden behind another. You can never see all 15 at once. No matter where you sit, no matter how you angle yourself, there is always one stone that remains out of view. People have been trying to explain this for 500 years. Some say it represents the impossibility of perfect knowledge, that there is always something you cannot see, no matter your position. Some say it represents the structure of enlightenment, that the hidden stone is the self, which cannot observe itself directly. Some say there is no meaning, that it is simply beautiful, and that beauty does not require explanation. The garden survived the war. Kyoto was on the list of atomic bomb targets. It was removed from the list, in part, because Henry Stimson, the American Secretary of War, had visited Kyoto on his honeymoon decades before and had loved it, and could not bring himself to authorize its destruction. One man's memory of a honeymoon. One city spared. The stone garden is still there. The gravel is still raked each morning by the monks. The 15th stone is still hidden, wherever you sit. Japan, after the war, did many things. It rebuilt its cities. It grew its economy. It wrote pacifism into its constitution and largely kept it there, across decades of pressure and argument and changing geopolitics, because a significant portion of its population had decided, from direct experience, that they were finished with war. Finished. Done. It also struggled with memory. Every country that has done terrible things struggles with memory. How to acknowledge what was done without destroying the present. How to grieve what was lost without being consumed by it. How to hold the complexity of a history that contains both the soldiers who committed atrocities and the civilians who opposed the war in private, and the children who knew nothing and the families who lost everything, all of them part of the same country. The same story, none of them reducible to a simple judgment. Japan's reckoning with its wartime conduct has been, by most accounts, incomplete. The history taught in Japanese schools has at times omitted or minimized the events in Nanjing, the comfort women, the forced labor. Some politicians have visited the Yasukuni Shrine, where the war dead are honored, including convicted war criminals, and the visits have caused diplomatic crises with China and Korea, wounds that have not fully healed. These are real failures. They matter. The dead of Nanjing deserve acknowledgement. The women who were forced into sexual slavery deserve acknowledgement. The nations that were occupied and exploited deserve acknowledgement. And alongside the failures, there are Japanese scholars who have dedicated their lives to uncovering and documenting the truth. There are textbooks that do include the history, teachers who teach it, museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that tell the story of the war in full, not only as Japan's victimization by the atomic bombs, but as the context of what led there. There are organizations of veterans who have made public confessions about what they did and what they witnessed. There are people in Japan doing, quietly and without celebration, the necessary work of honest memory. Both things are true. The failures and the efforts. The incomplete reckoning and the genuine reckoning. Human institutions are like this. History is like this. The hibakusha are almost gone now. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were young in 1945 children, mostly, or young adults. They are in their 80s and 90s now, the ones still living. There are fewer each year. The testimony they have carried, the witness they have kept, the direct, embodied, irreplaceable knowledge of what it was to be there is passing from the world. What remains when the last witness is gone is what was written down, recorded, preserved. The letters. The photographs. The oral histories that organizations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki have spent decades collecting and archiving. The testimony of Setsuko Thurlow, recorded and stored so that it can be played after she is no longer there to give it in person. Memory, when it can no longer be carried by living people, is carried by objects. By buildings. By documents. By stories told in the dark to people who are drifting towards sleep. This is why stories matter. Not as entertainment, though they are that too. As vessels. As the form in which the past travels toward the future, changed in the traveling, never exactly what it was, but alive. Still alive. Think for a moment about what 80 years means. A child born in Hiroshima in 1946, born into the rubble, born to parents who had survived the bomb, born into a city that was rebuilding itself from ash. That child is in their late 70s now. They have lived a full life in the country their parents helped rebuild. They have perhaps had children and grandchildren. They have eaten well, traveled, worked, loved, argued, laughed, read books, watched the cherry blossoms fall. They carry, in their body, the fact of what their parents survived. Not the radiation they were born after. The radiation does not pass that way. But the fact. The knowledge. The shape that a history leaves in a family, in the stories told at dinner tables, in the silences that sometimes fall when certain things are mentioned. History does not end when the events end. It continues in the people who come after, the people who were shaped by people who were shaped by the events, the long ripple of consequence moving through generations like water moving through stone, slowly, imperceptibly, but moving. Always moving. There is a word in Japanese, kibu, hope. But in the way Japanese words often work, it carries more than the simple English translation suggests. Ki is spirit, life force, the animating energy that flows through things. Bu is hope, desire, looking toward. Kibu is something like the spirit that looks forward. The life force that orients itself toward what might be, rather than only what has been. The people who survived the war practiced kibu without always having a name for it. They looked forward. They built. They planted rice in the fields and repaired the railways and sent their children to the new schools and argued about the new constitution and went to work in the new factories and, in spring, spread their blankets under the cherry trees. They did not forget. You cannot forget what they had lived through. But they also did not only remember. They held the past in one hand and reached forward with the other. Kibu. The spirit that looks forward. The Ota River still runs through Hiroshima. The 6 channels still spread across the delta toward the Seto Inland Sea, moving quietly over the same stones they have always moved over, indifferent to the centuries, carrying the same water that has always passed through on its way from the mountains to the ocean. The atomic bomb dome stands at the river's edge, the ruin kept standing as witness, the iron frame exposed against the sky, the same sky that the bomb came from 80 years ago. People walk past it every day. Tourists come from every country in the world and stand before it and are quiet for a moment before moving on. Children on school trips are brought here and stand in lines and listen to their teachers explain what they are looking at. The dome does not speak. It only stands. But standing is its own kind of speaking. Across the river, in the Peace Memorial Park, the cenotaph holds the names of the dead, all the names that could be collected, inscribed in books kept in a stone chest. The inscription on the cenotaph reads, in Japanese, "Rest in peace. The mistake shall not be repeated. The mistake shall not be repeated." 8 words. A promise made by the living to the dead. A promise that requires constant renewal, that can never be made once and set aside, that must be made again by each generation as it comes into the knowledge of what the promise is about. We are among the generations making it now. This is where the story ends. Not with triumph, this was never a story of triumph. Not with simple grief. Grief alone is not enough for what we have carried. But here, at the river, at the dome, at the cenotaph with its 8 words. At the cherry trees, which are blooming somewhere right now, or will bloom again when the season turns, as they always have and will continue to do, brief and abundant and falling, filling the air with petals that drift on the wind and settle on the water and are carried gently, without resistance, downstream. The war is over. The people who lived through it mostly lived long lives, and died in their own beds, in a country at peace. The children they raised grew up and raised children of their own, in a country at peace. The cities rebuilt themselves, stone by stone and beam by beam, until the skylines rose again and the trains ran and the lights came on at night and the markets filled with food and people walked through the markets in the evening and bought things for dinner and went home. The mistake shall not be repeated. You have been a good keeper of this story. You have listened, and listening is not a small thing. You have let the weight of it settle into you without being crushed by it, which is the only way to carry history not above you, not at a distance, but in you, held gently, part of what you know about what human beings are and have been and might yet be. Now let it rest. Let your breath come slow and deep. Let the river carry whatever remains. The water moves. The petals fall. The stone garden waits in its stillness, the 15th stone hidden, just out of view, as it has always been, patient and quiet. Sleep now. You are safe. The world is, tonight, at peace. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Good night.